It was a quiet night, the kind that should have been peaceful. My house stood just up ahead, my truck rolling smoothly down the street I'd lived on for years. Nothing seemed out of place, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Maybe it was the way the streetlights flickered or the odd shadows shifting near my driveway. I should have trusted that feeling. The second I stepped out of my truck, heavy footsteps rushed toward me. Before I could turn, a rough hand slammed me against the hood. Metal bit into my wrists as cold handcuffs snapped tight. "The hell?" I gritted out, twisting to see who had just made the biggest mistake of their life. "You're under arrest for trespassing," a voice barked, low and commanding. I blinked, trying to process the sheer stupidity of the statement. Trespassing? On my own property. I craned my neck and got my first good look at my so-called arresting officer. The man was tall, bulky, with a cheap uniform stretched too tight over his gut. His belt was polished to a mirror shine, but the way he held himself screamed of someone who spent more time watching cop shows than learning actual law. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. He tightened his grip on my arm. "Think it's funny? Let's see how much you're laughing at the station, buddy." "Buddy?" I echoed, trying not to laugh despite the absurdity. "I live here." "Nice try," he shot back. "You criminals always have an excuse." I exhaled slowly, forcing my irritation down. "My name is Sheriff Clay Hensley," I said. "I am the actual sheriff of this county." The man snorted. "Oh yeah? Where's your badge?" "In my wallet," I said evenly, "which you knocked to the ground." His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked even more smug, like I had just told him I was a time traveler. "Sure," he sneered. "You got any other fairy tales for me?" That's when headlights swept across us, and a familiar car slowed to a stop at the curb. A window rolled down, and a voice I knew all too well rang out. "What in the hell, Clay? Are you getting arrested?" I sighed. "Not funny, Tyler." The real deputy, my lieutenant, was barely holding back laughter. The idiot restraining me, however, straightened like he'd just been called on in class. His name tag read, Bruce Wendell. Bruce squared his shoulders and scowled at my lieutenant. "This is none of your business, officer. HOA security is handling this." Tyler nearly choked. "Bruce, you just handcuffed the actual sheriff." Silence. Bruce's face paled, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "This man violated HOA regulations. His truck has an unapproved decal." Tyler's expression went from amusement to disbelief. "Bruce, that's a county sheriff's decal." Still, Bruce refused to admit his mistake. He huffed, muttered something about rogue officers breaking HOA rules, then finally clicked open the cuffs, like he was doing me a favor. My wrists throbbed as I rubbed at them, but I was too busy shaking my head to care. "You'll be hearing from the HOA board," Bruce warned, puffing out his chest. "Can't wait," I deadpanned, bending to pick up my wallet and badge from where they'd fallen. Bruce stormed off, but I didn't move right away. Something about this whole situation wasn't sitting right. Bruce wasn't just some overzealous HOA guy. There was something else going on. And the next morning, that uneasy feeling hadn't gone away, so I did what I did best. I started digging. And what I found made my jaw tighten. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Bruce Wendell wasn't just some overzealous HOA enforcer who got a little power hungry. The way he had looked at me, the way he had refused to back down, even when faced with the truth. It told me there was something bigger at play, so I did what I do best. I started digging. First, I pulled up public complaints related to HOA violations in my neighborhood. What I found made my jaw tighten. In the past 2 months, there had been dozens of reports about Bruce's so-called patrol unit issuing citations for absurd reasons. Residents were being fined for leaving a garden hose visible, using the wrong shade of mulch, or even hanging wind chimes that were too loud. But it wasn't just nitpicking, it was targeted harassment. The same handful of houses were getting repeated violations, all leading to residents selling their homes at suspiciously low prices. That set off every alarm bell in my head. I needed to talk to someone who had their ear to the ground. Lucky for me, my neighbor Mrs. Jenkins had been keeping track of everything happening in the community. She was the kind of person who noticed every strange car on the street, every late-night visitor, and every unusual conversation overheard at the local grocery store, and she loved to talk. When I knocked on her door, she was already waiting with a knowing look on her face. "Took you long enough, Sheriff," she said, ushering me inside. The moment I sat down, she launched into a full breakdown of what had been happening. Bruce's crew had been aggressively targeting specific homeowners, especially older folks or anyone who seemed vulnerable. They would start with small citations, then escalate to late-night visits, threats of legal action, and constant intimidation. She told me about a retired couple down the block who had been fined for having unauthorized flower pots on their porch. When they pushed back, their car mysteriously ended up with a flat tire. A week later, they got another fine for excessive lawn decorations. Within a month, they had sold their home and moved out. But that wasn't the worst of it. Mrs. Jenkins leaned in, lowering her voice like we were in some kind of spy movie. "Bruce's gang is out at night, sneaking into yards," she whispered. "They've got no shame. They poke around, looking for any excuse to slap another violation on someone, and once they start, they don't stop until people pack up and leave." She pulled out a notebook filled with dates and addresses. "See this? Every house they've been harassing sold within weeks. That couldn't be a coincidence." I flipped through the pages and noticed a pattern. All the properties had been bought by the same investment company, Sandalwood Properties. I had never heard of them, but something about it felt wrong. I drove back to the station and started digging into Sandalwood's history. What I found made my stomach turn. The company was owned by a man named Victor Calder, a real estate mogul with a reputation for exploiting vulnerable homeowners. His company was known for swooping in on distressed properties, buying them dirt cheap, and flipping them for massive profits. And the worst part, the same pattern had played out in multiple neighborhoods. Reports of aggressive HOA enforcement, outrageous fines, people moving out in frustration. Then, within weeks, Sandalwood Properties stepping in to buy up the homes. It was a racket, a well-orchestrated scheme designed to drive property values down just long enough for Calder to move in and make a killing. And Bruce Wendell, it was just a pawn. I needed proof. That night, I parked my truck down the street and waited. Sure enough, just after midnight, I spotted Bruce and two other men creeping down the sidewalk, flashlights in hand. They stopped in front of old Mr. Grady's house. He was a frail man, in his 80s, lived alone and rarely left his home. Bruce tapped on Grady's window with the back of a flashlight. A few seconds later, I saw Grady shuffle to the door in his pajamas, confused and half asleep. Bruce wasted no time. "You've got an illegal garden gnome," he snapped, "and your curtains are the wrong color. We're giving you 1 week to fix it, or the HOA will move forward with fines." I had seen enough. I stepped out of the shadows. "Bruce," I called out, my voice cutting through the quiet night. "Care to explain why you're intimidating an 82-year-old man at midnight?" Bruce spun around, startled. His flashlight shot into my eyes. "This is Hecho's business," he barked. "No," I said flatly. "This is harassment." Bruce puffed out his chest. "I'm authorized by the HOA to enforce regulations." "Funny," I said, stepping closer, "because last I checked, neither you nor the HOA have any authority to wake up senior citizens at midnight or harass people into leaving their homes." Bruce's two lackeys bolted, disappearing into the night. But Bruce, stubborn as ever, reached for something on his belt. I tensed, prepared for a weapon. But what he pulled out made me want to laugh. A cheap plastic badge. "I'll have you know," he said dramatically, "that I have full legal right to detain you." I sighed. "Bruce," I said, "put the toy away." But he didn't. He actually lunged, trying to grab my arm again like he had the night before. Before he could lay a hand on me, I sidestepped, twisted his wrist, and had him on the ground in seconds. He grunted, face pressed against the pavement. "This," I said, pulling out my badge, "is what a real sheriff's badge looks like." By the time backup arrived, Bruce was screaming about conspiracies, calling me a rogue officer, swearing that the HOA board would hear about this. I almost pitied him. Almost. The next morning, I started digging deeper. Bruce had been more than a nuisance. He was dangerous. And it turned out he wasn't working alone. That night I couldn't sleep. Bruce was in custody, but something about this whole thing felt unfinished. He wasn't smart enough to be running a scheme this big on his own. He was a blunt instrument, a thug in a cheap uniform playing cop. The real mastermind had to be someone higher up, someone who understood how to manipulate people and the market. So I kept digging. By morning I had a name, Victor Calder, owner of Sandalwood Properties, the man profiting from every single home Bruce had helped drive onto the market. I had a feeling. Calder wasn't sitting behind a desk just waiting for houses to fall into his lap. He was orchestrating this whole thing, and I was going to catch him in the act. That night, I parked my truck a block away from a row of homes that had been sitting vacant for weeks, all properties Calder had bought after Bruce had run their previous owners out of town. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but my gut told me someone was going to slip up. Around 1 a.m., I spotted movement. Two shadowy figures were walking down the sidewalk, flashlights in hand. Even from a distance, I recognized the Hota polo shirts they wore, the same fake authority Bruce had been flashing around. but Bruce was in a holding cell, which meant these guys were still operating without him. That told me two things. This didn't start with Bruce, and it sure as hell wasn't stopping now. I watched as they stopped in front of a house with a for sale sign. One of them knelt by the front door, reaching into his jacket. A few seconds later, I saw the metallic glint of a screwdriver. My stomach tightened. They weren't here to issue fines. They were breaking in. It made sense. If they tampered with the locks or damaged the property, potential buyers would be discouraged. Then Sandalwood Properties would swoop in with an easy cash offer before the owner even had time to fix the damage. It was a dirty trick, and these guys had been running it under the cover of HOA enforcement. But tonight they had picked the wrong house. I stepped out of my truck, moving quickly but quietly until I was close enough that my voice would carry. I flicked on my flashlight. "I'd rethink that if I were you." The man with the screwdriver froze. His partner bolted immediately, sprinting down the street like his life depended on it, but the guy kneeling at the lock hesitated a second too long. I grabbed his arm just as he tried to run, yanking him backward. "Let me go," he barked, trying to twist free. "I'm with HOA security." "Yeah," I said, tightening my grip. "Then explain why you're breaking into a vacant home at 1 a.m. He stammered, but I wasn't in the mood to play games. I dragged him back to my truck, cuffed him, and started asking questions. At first, he gave me the same nonsense about enforcing HOA regulations. But when I mentioned Bruce Wendell's name, his face went pale. After a few more minutes of pressure, he spilled everything. Bruce's so-called patrol unit had been actively breaking into vacant homes, replacing locks, tampering with for-sale signs, anything they could do to make it harder for legitimate buyers to connect with the homeowners. Meanwhile, Sandalwood Properties would conveniently step in, offering to help desperate owners sell before things got worse. It was a con one that had already forced multiple families out of their homes, and it was all being done under the pretense of neighborhood safety. Now I had the proof I needed. It was time to pay Victor Calder a visit, but this time I wasn't going alone. The next morning I walked into the station with a file thick enough to break a desk in half. I had everything I needed: testimonies, footage, records of every house that had been targeted, and the undeniable connection to Sandalwood Properties. But I wasn't ready to make a move just yet. I wanted to see the man behind all of this, the one pulling the strings. I wanted to look Victor Calder in the eye and let him know his little operation was about to come crashing down. Calder's office was downtown, nestled in a sleek, glass-covered building that reeked of wealth and power. Everything about it was polished and pristine, the kind of place where men in tailored suits made backroom deals over overpriced scotch. It was a far cry from the neighborhood he had been terrorizing. I walked in unannounced, flashing my badge just enough to make the receptionist nervous. Within minutes, a well-dressed man emerged from a side office, his smile cool and calculated. He was tall, lean, with a sharp suit and the kind of confidence that came from years of bending the law in his favor. "Sheriff Hensley," he greeted smoothly, extending a hand I had no intention of shaking. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I didn't waste time. I know about your deals with Bruce Wendell. I know you've been targeting homeowners with harassment to force them into selling their homes. It ends today." Calder didn't flinch. If anything, his smile widened. Now, Sheriff," he chuckled, leaning against his desk, "I simply buy properties that come onto the market. If a few homeowners decide they don't like the neighborhood anymore, well, that's not my fault." I stepped closer, watching his expression carefully. "Cut the act. I've got enough evidence to prove Bruce was working for you. Harassment, intimidation, trespassing, and that's just the start. The racket ends now." Calder let out a small laugh, like he had heard this speech 100 times before. "Sheriff, my company operates within the law. If you're looking to build a case, I suggest you try harder. Bruce Wendell is a loose cannon. I barely know the man." I could see the arrogance in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. It pissed me off, but I knew better than to lose my temper. I leaned in just enough to make my next words sting. "Then you won't mind if I start digging into your finances? Every shell company, every deal you've ever made? I'm going to find the bodies, Calder, and when I do, you won't be sitting in this nice office anymore." His smile faltered, just for a second, but then he straightened, exhaling like he was growing bored. "Good luck, Sheriff. Real estate can be complicated." I left without another word, but I wasn't walking away. Calder had just made a critical mistake. He thought he was safe because I didn't have enough to put cuffs on him that second, but he had underestimated just how determined I could be. That night I drove back to my neighborhood and parked near a row of homes that had been empty for weeks, all properties Calder had purchased after Bruce's harassment tactics had done their job. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew someone would slip up. Around 1 a.m., I spotted two figures walking down the sidewalk. Bruce's arrest had left his patrol unit short-handed, but these two still wore matching HOA-branded polos. They stopped in front of a house with a for-sale sign. One of them reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a screwdriver. The man knelt by the front door, fiddling with the lock. I stepped out of my truck, my voice cutting through the night. "That's enough." The two men froze. One bolted immediately, sprinting down the street like he had been training for this moment his whole life. The other hesitated, then made the wrong choice. He reached for something in his pocket. I was faster. I grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back before he could make a move. He struggled, but I had him cuffed and pinned against the side of my truck within seconds. "You have no right to do this," he spat, his voice laced with panic. "Neither do you," I shot back. "Explain why you're breaking into a vacant home at 1 a.m. At first, he stuck to his script. HOA security, enforcing regulations, just making sure the property was up to standard. But when I mentioned Bruce Wendell's name, he paled. When I brought up Sandalwood Properties, he started sweating. After a few minutes of pressure, he finally cracked. Bruce's patrol unit had been actively breaking into vacant homes, replacing locks, tampering with property signs, anything they could do to make it harder for potential buyers to connect with legitimate sellers. Meanwhile, Calder's company would swoop in with a cash offer, preying on homeowners who had been backed into a corner. I didn't wait until morning. I called my deputies, and we drove straight to Calder's office with a search warrant in hand. Inside, we found everything we needed. Emails between Calder and Bruce discussing targets, records of fraudulent violations, manipulated HOA notices. Calder had been running this game for months, maybe years, but tonight, his luck had run out. I was halfway through reading one of Calder's incriminating emails when he walked in, his face going from cocky to pale in a matter of seconds. "You can't prove anything," he stammered. I held up a thick folder. "Actually, I can prove everything." Within hours, Bruce's entire patrol unit was rounded up, charged with criminal trespassing, harassment, and conspiracy. Calder himself faced fraud charges, and his entire real estate empire was about to crumble. I watched as he was led out of his office in handcuffs, his suit wrinkled, his confidence shattered. By the time the sun came up, my neighborhood felt different. Lighter. The fake HOA patrol had been shut down, residents were breathing easier, and for the first time in months, people weren't afraid to step outside their own homes. It was a win. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I should have known it wasn't over. Bruce was in jail, Calder's real estate scam was crumbling, and the fake HOA patrol had been shut down. Yet somehow, here I was again, standing in the middle of my neighborhood, staring at a man in a neatly pressed HOA security uniform, clipboard tucked under his arm, sunglasses making him look far more important than he actually was. He had been lurking near the edge of the block party for over an hour, watching everyone like he was surveying a crime scene. Something about him didn't sit right. I walked over, my boots crunching against the pavement. He barely glanced at me before offering a tight, forced smile. "Good evening, sir," he said, his tone too smooth, too rehearsed. "Enjoying the festivities?" I folded my arms. "I'm Sheriff Hensley. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" He lifted his sunglasses and gave me an exaggerated look of mock surprise. "Oh, Sheriff, glad you're here. I'm with HOA Security, the new team, just observing to ensure the neighborhood stays safe." "You sure about that?" I asked, watching his expression carefully, because the last HOA patrol spent more time harassing residents than protecting them. He chuckled like I had just told a joke. "I can assure you, I'm nothing like those guys. Just following board orders." I didn't like his tone. Before I could press him further, I heard the unmistakable sound of Mrs. Jenkins shuffling over. She was armed, as always, with her ever-present phone. She eyed the man suspiciously, then turned to me. "Is this another one?" she asked, loud enough for half the party to turn and stare. "Because I've got my camera ready if he tries anything funny." The man's smile thinned. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, before walking away. The party wound down later that evening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still brewing. Over the next few days, rumors started swirling. Some residents claimed the new HOA security was already issuing petty citations, parking violations, even warning letters about non-compliant mailboxes. None of it seemed as aggressive as Bruce's old tactics, but it still felt wrong. Then things escalated. I got a call from an elderly couple down the street. They claimed HOA security had entered their backyard without permission, saying they were inspecting their fence for violations. By the time I arrived, The couple was shaken and furious. Their gate had been left open, and their tiny skittish terrier had run off. They had spent hours looking for him, heartbroken. That was all the proof I needed. This wasn't just an overzealous security officer. This was Bruce's style all over again. Someone was trying to bring back the same tactics under a new name. I drove straight to the HOA office to confront the board. The meeting was already in progress when I walked in. The room fell silent as I approached the front. The same man from the block party, the smug one with the clipboard, was standing beside the board president. His name tag read, Keith Anner, PHOA Security Chief. Sheriff, the president greeted me nervously. We weren't expecting you. You should have been, I said. Your new security team is already causing problems. The president glanced at Keith, who shrugged. Just doing our job, Keith said smoothly. We've been enforcing regulations. Can't let the neighborhood fall into chaos. Your team broke into a resident's backyard, I shot back. A family's dog is missing because of you. That's unfortunate, Keith said, his tone completely insincere, but we have a responsibility to maintain community standards. Is that what you're calling it? I asked, because last I checked, trespassing and harassment weren't part of your HOA's job description. Keith folded his arms. We're acting within the bylaws. I knew that wasn't true, but before I could argue further, a familiar voice spoke up from the back of the room. This is exactly what I warned you about, Mrs. Jenkins called out, her voice carrying across the room. We let one crooked patrol in, and now we've got another one. Keith shot her a glare, but Mrs. Jenkins stood her ground. I'm not letting my neighborhood turn into Bruce Wendell's playground again, she added firmly. The board shuffled uncomfortably, clearly unsure whose side to take. I knew I didn't have enough hard evidence yet, but Keith had just made a mistake. He had revealed his arrogance. That was something I could use. That night, I decided to do a little investigating of my own. I parked my truck down the street and kept watch on Keith's car. Around midnight, I saw him pull into the neighborhood with another man in tow. They weren't dressed like security officers, just two guys in dark clothes creeping around with flashlights. I followed from a distance. They stopped in front of a house that had recently been put up for sale. One of the same homes Bruce's crew had targeted before. Keith's partner pulled a screwdriver from his pocket and began tampering with the lock. It was the same trick Bruce's crew had used, sabotaging homes to make them seem unsafe or poorly maintained, all to pressure owners into selling. I stepped out of the shadows and flicked on my flashlight. That's enough, I said firmly. Keith spun around, his face contorting in anger. You have no right to be here, he snapped. Neither do you, I said. Step away from the door. You can't prove anything, Keith sneered. I don't need to, I said, holding up my phone. I've been recording since you parked. Keith's face twisted in panic. He bolted, but I was faster. I tackled him before he made it 10 steps and cuffed him on the spot. His partner tried to slip away, but one of my deputies, who I'd called earlier, stepped out from the shadows and grabbed him before he could vanish. The next morning, Keith was in handcuffs, and I presented my evidence to the HOA board. Between the footage, Keith's confession, and his connection to Calder's old company, the board had no choice but to dissolve the HOA security program altogether. A week later, the missing terrier was found safe and sound, thanks to a local teenager who had spotted him hiding under a porch. The elderly couple was overjoyed, and the whole neighborhood felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in weeks, things felt peaceful again. At the next community gathering, Mrs. Jenkins proudly declared herself the new unofficial neighborhood watch, armed with her phone, her sharp tongue, and her endless determination. I don't need a badge, she told me. I've got better tools. I believed her, but as I stood on my porch that evening watching the sunset dip behind the rooftops, I felt that familiar unease creeping in. A sleek black car rolled slowly down the street, pausing in front of one of the homes Calder's company had targeted. The driver sat still, watching, waiting. I sighed, setting down my coffee. Mrs. Jenkins was right. This wasn't over. It never really was. The morning after Keith's arrest, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word spread fast. By noon, everyone knew that the so-called new HOA security chief had been caught red-handed, breaking into a house and hauled off in cuffs. But I wasn't celebrating yet. I had learned my lesson with Calder and Bruce. Taking down one piece of the puzzle didn't mean the game was over. I needed to make sure this entire operation was burned to the ground so no one could rebuild it. I spent the next 48 hours putting every piece together. The emails, the recorded conversations, the falsified violation notices, the bank transactions linking Keith and his crew to Calder's investment firm. It was airtight. By the time I walked into the HOA board's emergency meeting. I knew I had them cornered. The board members sat stiffly around the long table, eyes shifting uncomfortably as I dropped the thick file onto the surface with a satisfying thud. "You should probably start reading," I said, folding my arms. The president hesitated before reaching for the first page. His face drained of color as he scanned the documents. I saw a few of the others lean over, their brows furrowing as they read about Keith's little side business, the break-ins, the intimidation tactics, the falsified HOA citations meant to drive homeowners into selling. One woman gasped when she saw the evidence linking Calder directly to the board's finances. I let the silence stretch before speaking again. "You have two choices," I said. "One, you can pretend you didn't know this was happening and let your entire HOA get sued into oblivion. 2, you dissolve the security team, clean house, and make it very clear that this kind of racket will never happen in this neighborhood again." The president swallowed hard. "And if we choose the first option?" I smiled. "Then I guarantee you within 24 hours, your names will be all over the evening news, right next to Calder's mugshot." But he didn't need more convincing. Within the hour, the HOA security program was officially shut down. Keith and his crew were permanently banned from any future involvement in neighborhood governance. Any pending violation, fines issued under their watch were nullified. It was over. Or at least, it should have been. That night I took a slow walk through the neighborhood, the air crisp with the scent of freshly cut grass and barbecues firing up for an impromptu celebration. People had come out of their houses, talking and laughing again, no longer looking over their shoulders for some upward-wielding thug waiting to fine them for having the wrong color of porch lights. The mood was lighter, the tension that had settled over the community for months finally lifting. Mrs. Jenkins found me near my truck, her phone still in hand, her expression smug. "Told you this wasn't over," she said. "Yeah," I admitted, taking a sip of my coffee. "But I think we've seen the last of Bruce and his goons." She smirked and pointed across the street. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach tighten. Standing just beyond the reach of the streetlights was a man in a freshly pressed HOA uniform, clipboard tucked under his arm, sunglasses perched on his nose, even though the sun had set hours ago. He wasn't making a scene, wasn't walking up to anyone, just watching, waiting. I exhaled slowly. Here we go again. Mrs. Jenkins raised her phone. "Want me to film it?" "Not yet," I muttered. "Let's see how this plays out." The man noticed us staring, and for a brief moment, I thought he would turn away. Instead, he smiled, gave a slow nod, then disappeared into the night. The celebration continued, the sound of laughter and music filling the air, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking beneath the surface. Calder was in jail, Keith's operation had been shut down, but someone somewhere was still pulling the strings. I leaned against my truck, staring at the spot where the man had stood. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.